The first time I heard the crying was on a Tuesday midnight shift, filling out medication charts in Ward 3 of St. Lucy's Hospital in Riverside, Ohio. A wet, distant sound, like it came from deep inside a waterlogged tunnel. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs, cold sweat trickling down my neck. The main hallway was empty, lit only by emergency lights, that artificial glow turning everything sickly shades of gray. The decommissioned pediatric wing sat at the end of that hall, an entire block sealed off 15 years ago, after the ventilation system incident. Nobody talked about what really happened there, just whispers about children who didn't make it through the night. The rusted metal doors, painted green decades back, were chained shut with thick links and a padlock that looked like it belonged on a prison gate. But the crying came from there. I was certain. It was the kind of certainty that settles in your bones, a physical, heavy feeling. Not the cry of a colicky baby. Something older, shallower, like someone trying to mimic the sound and failing miserably. I went back to the nurse's station, my trembling hands nearly spilling my coffee. I told myself it was wind in the old ducts, or the building settling. But St. Lucy's was new, gleaming, built after the old wing was condemned. The ducts didn't creak. The next night, it was Sarah who came to me. Her face, normally rosy and full of life, was pale as chart paper. Her eyes, sunken and dark, looked shrunken. She held something cradled in a paper towel. It was a tin toy car, the old-fashioned kind, all rusted and twisted. The jammed wheels looked like they'd been buried and dug up. Found it in the hall, near the service stairs, she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was that sound, David. The lullaby. Rockabye baby. That damned lullaby. She trembled. The car was cold, even through the towel. A reddish-brown rust stained the paper. There was no construction dust in that corridor, nowhere an antique toy like that could have been hiding. Logical explanation evaporated. A rusted toy doesn't just appear in a modern, clean hospital where sterility is an obsession. Especially not near the decommissioned wing. Especially not after cries and lullabies. The occurrences intensified. They became part of the night shift landscape, like the dim lighting or the low hum of the medication fridges. Toys appeared. A porcelain doll with a broken eye and a ragged dress, found by Mike, the security guard, under the reception chair. A wooden rocking horse, chipped and maneless, abandoned in the middle of the service elevator. Always cold to the touch. Always appearing from a direction that pointed, like an invisible arrow, toward the green wing. The lullabies were the worst. Not just Rockabye Baby. We heard fragments of others, melodies warped, like played on a radio with dying batteries. Sometimes, laughter. Not joyful, life-filled laughter, but sharp, brief giggles, followed by a silence so thick it seemed to choke the air. They laughed in the darkness behind those chained doors. They laughed at us. Administration, of course, didn't believe. Supervisor Henderson came during the day, with his tight tie and shiny tablet. He inspected the area, reviewed the security footage. Nothing here, folks, he said, with that condescending smile healthcare workers learn to hate. Stress, long shifts, shadows and old building noises settling. He ordered a full cleaning of the area outside the decommissioned wing, as if brooms could sweep away ghosts. It was after that cleaning that the lights started. Weak, flickering lights, like candles about to gutter, coming from the high, grimy windows of the old wing. Windows that shouldn't have any light, as there'd been no power to that sector for 15 years. The circuit was physically cut, the electrician said. We verified. They flickered irregularly, pulsing with a life of their own, a rhythm that seemed to match the distant lullabies. It was impossible to ignore. It was impossible to rationalize. Fear took root among us, the night shift. Sarah lost weight. Her eyes, once so alive, had deep purple bags. She jumped at the smallest sound. Mike, the security guard, a big man who'd faced down armed robbers, now avoided the main hall after midnight. He stayed in the security booth, watching the monitors, his hand always near the panic button. I felt a constant pressure in my chest myself, a sensation of being watched even when alone in a locked medroom. The hospital, our workplace, our second home, had become a place of shadows and whispers. The smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the phantom odor of damp earth and mildew that sometimes hung in the air, drifting from the end of the hall. It was Mike who had the idea to check the cameras aimed inside the decommissioned wing through the small, wire-reinforced windows in the main doors. Standard security cameras, installed when the block was closed, just to visually monitor the emptiness. No one had checked them in years. We accessed the archived feed, a massive, dusty digital file within the system. We looked for movement, for anything. The first few hours were static emptiness, dust dancing in shafts of light from the high windows. Furniture covered in white sheets, stained by time and dampness, looking like crouched shapes in the dark. Then, on the recording from the previous night, we saw it. Only for an instant, a quick blur crossing the field of view of camera 7, pointing down the wing's central corridor. Something low. Something moving fast. A shadow, but not a cast shadow. It was denser, visually tangible, more concrete than the surrounding gloom. Like a child running. A fraction of a second later, another one. Two small, dark shapes, fleeing across the edge of the frame, coming from nowhere, going to nowhere. There was no open door there. No broken window. It was an internal corridor, sealed. My blood turned to ice. Sarah let out a low, stifled moan. Mike stood frozen, his face a mask of pure terror. Not rats, not illusions. Small, humanoid shapes, fleeing in the darkness of a place that should have been empty and dead. And now, as I write this, sitting at the station at 3:47 a.m., I hear it again. Not a lullaby. A slow, deliberate dragging of feet. Coming from the other side of the door, separating the main hall from the decommissioned pediatric wing. Something is moving out there, on the other side. Something stopping right in front of the door. The air is cold, too cold for the AC. The smell of wet earth and something else, a sickly sweet, rotten odor like flowers forgotten on a grave, is suffocating. The emergency lights flicker, weak, threatening to die. I know I should call someone. I know I should check. But my legs won't obey. Fear is a physical thing, a weight pinning me to this chair. The dragging feet stopped. Now there is silence. An active, watchful silence. Someone or something is standing on the other side of that door. Waiting. Listening. Just like I am listening. Just like you, listening to me right now, are probably listening to the sounds in your own home, questioning every creak, every whisper of the wind. Did you hear something? Something that shouldn't be there. Because terror feeds on doubt, on what we don't see but feel deep in our neck, in that unexplained draft of cold air. The chain on the pediatric wing door rattled. A sharp, metallic sound, like links being tested. Not the wind. Pressure. Someone or something is trying to push. The chains are thick, but the padlock seems smaller, more fragile, under the weight of the concentrated darkness on the other side. The lights flicker faster, a strobing dance of madness. Shadows on the wall behind me stretch, twist, taking on shapes that are not human. The air is thin, every breath an effort. The sweet, rotten smell intensified, coating my throat. The door shuddered. A dull thud, like a small body being thrown against the metal. Then another, and another. Not a furious assault. Persistence. The persistence of someone who has all the time in the world, or exists outside of it. The laughter returned. Not from inside the decommissioned wing anymore. From everywhere. Whispered in the ventilation ducts, echoing from empty exam rooms, a chorus of childish giggles, high-pitched and joyless, swirling around me like vultures. The toys we collected, stored in a box in the supply closet, started to rattle. On their own. A frantic, metallic clinking, keeping time with the thuds on the door. The computer screen in front of me glitched. For a moment, amidst the digital snow, I saw the feed from Camera 7 inside the decommissioned wing. It wasn't empty anymore. The sheet-covered shapes had risen. Under the stained white cloth, there was no furniture. There were small silhouettes, with disproportionate heads. Hundreds of them. Still, facing the camera. Facing me. The last thud on the door was louder. I heard metal giving way. The lights went out. Everything is darkness. Everything is laughter. Everything is the smell of earth from a garden that never existed here. And the only light left is the steady red glow of the security camera above the door to the decommissioned wing. It's lit. Someone turned the power on inside. The padlock clattered to the floor with a final clang. The door creaks, slowly opening into absolute blackness. The cold rushing in is not of this world, a cold like an open grave. The laughter stops. A single, collective, wet sigh fills the corridor. They're coming, and there are no more doors to hold them. Not in this wing. Not in this hospital. Maybe not even in your bedroom, right now, as you listen, trying to tell yourself it's just tree branches tapping the window. Is it? Look toward the darkest corner of your room. Look hard. Did something move? Or was it just your imagination? Is your closet door securely shut? Because terror never stays confined for long. It finds cracks. It finds ears willing to listen. Like yours, right now. They are coming. For me. For you. The darkness is the path. And the lost children, they've finally found someone to play with. The overnight shift in the laundry room of Burlington County General Hospital had always been about the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a heavy, damp silence, thick with the constant drone of industrial machines and the penetrating smell of bleach and fabric softener that tried, and failed, to mask the phantom odor of old sickness. We worked in the basement, Carl, Rita, and me, in a vast concrete maze where fluorescent lights flickered over endless rows of bone-white sheets, pillowcases, and surgical scrubs. Wash, dry, fold. That was our mantra, our entire world reduced to 3 a.m., when the rest of the hospital above us slept or suffered, until the stains started appearing. It was in a batch of sheets from orthopedics. They came down the chute clean, white as polished bone, and came out of the massive washing machine with a grime that didn't belong to any human wound. Dirt. Dark, damp earth, almost mud, ground into the fabric like it had been rubbed in with force. It smelled like rotten forest, like roots decomposing under a thick blanket of dead leaves. Carl noticed it first. His weathered face creased in confusion. He was the oldest, had been an over-the-road hauler covering half the U.S. before settling here, and he said that dirt smelled wrong. Not like the red clay of Georgia, nor the sandy loam of the coast. It was something older, deeper. We ignored it, chalked it up to a bizarre accident. Critical error. The stains multiplied. Sheets from Pediatrics came back smeared with dried, fine herbs, like crushed old tea leaves, giving off a sweetly musty odor that clung to the throat. Pillowcases from ICU had sticky smears of an amber, viscous fluid, like rancid honey mixed with something chemical and rotten. The smell was the worst. A nauseating blend of wet cemetery soil, sour honey, and meat left in the sun. The industrial bleach, our shield against all the hospital's impurities, failed miserably. The grime resisted, embedded, as if it was part of the fabric itself. The air in the laundry grew thick, oppressive, saturated with that foul miasma that seemed to seep into our pores. Then the shadows started moving. Not the shadows cast by the piles of clean laundry stacked in unstable towers, forming narrow, dark corridors. They were figures. Too thin, too pale, like corpses desiccated by centuries under the earth. I'd see them from the corner of my eye, turning to grab more sheets from the dryer. A hunched, bony silhouette ducking rapidly behind a stack of blankets. An indistinct shape, just a smear of paleness against the deeper gloom, standing at the end of an aisle formed by folded linens, vanishing when I focused my flashlight. Rita, always pragmatic, started refusing to go alone to the temporary storage area, a corner that was particularly badly lit and full of towering piles. She whispered about feeling eyes on her, a physical sensation of cold on the nape of her neck, even with the stifling heat from the machines. Carl tried confronting them. One night, after a particularly revolting amber stain on an isolation sheet, he saw a more defined figure crouched behind a soiled linen cart. It was just bones and stretched skin, a head too large for its fragile neck, sparse hair like dead grass. The eyes, sunk too deep in the sockets, reflected the weak light like a nocturnal animal's. Carl advanced, his anger overcoming the icy fear he must have felt, yelling something about trespassers and vandalism. The figure didn't move, just stared at him, until Carl took 2 more firm steps forward. Then, it simply wasn't there anymore. Vanished. Didn't run. Didn't hide better. Dematerialized in the damp air, leaving only the intensified smell of rotten earth and spoiled honey. Carl came back to us, paler than the linens we washed, his fingers trembling slightly as he lit a broken cigarette. He didn't speak about what he saw in detail, but his silence was more terrifying than any description. The laundry ceased being our basement refuge. It became a sensory torture chamber. The drone of the machines morphed into a constant lament. The fluorescent lights flickered more frequently, plunging us into brief intervals of total darkness where breath caught and ears rang with the expectation of an icy touch. Every new stain was a violation, proof that something profoundly wrong and unclean was happening. The dirt seemed to come from a sunless place. The dried herbs had a strangely brittle texture, like tiny bird bones. The amber fluid, touched accidentally, was cold and left a filmy feeling water and soap wouldn't remove. And the figures grew bolder, no longer content to linger on the fringes. You'd see a skeletal arm, coated in a thin layer of something resembling dried mud, withdrawing from behind the main washer. A bare, bony, dirty foot glimpsed under a pile of sheets before disappearing. And the eyes. Always the eyes, watching from dark crevices, gleaming with a dark intelligence and a hunger that wasn't physical, but something worse. Fear consumed us. Rita jumped at the smallest noise, her dark eyes, once so lively, now ceaselessly scanning the shadows, exhausted. Carl grew quieter, spending more time leaning against the cold wall, smoking, watching the aisles between the piles with the concentration of a hunter or prey. I caught myself avoiding looking directly into the darkest corners. I started hearing whispers in the gaps between the rumble of the dryers, hoarse, shredded voices hissing words I couldn't understand, but that carried a sense of ancient despair and rage. It was as if the concrete walls themselves, saturated with decades of hospital suffering, were sweating out this malignant presence. And here, right now, as I write this in the relative safety of daylight, yet still feeling the basement's clammy chill in my spine, I need to pause. You, listening to this story, might think we were just stressed night workers imagining things in fatigue and darkness. Maybe you believe the isolation and oppressive basement environment played tricks on our minds. I wished, with every fiber of my being, that was all it was. But it wasn't fatigue that made those stains of earth and amber fluid resist wash cycles with chemicals strong enough to drop a bull. It wasn't paranoia that made Rita scream upon seeing a pale, emaciated figure, this time only a yard away, reaching a bony, dirt-caked hand towards a pile of clean sheets before dissolving like smoke. And it wasn't madness that made Carl, the most solid man I knew, weep softly in the locker room, saying the whispers were calling him by name, the name of his daughter who died years ago. The final straw, or rather the flood of terror, came when the amber fluid stopped being a stain. We found a pillowcase soaked, dripping that cold, sticky substance, as if dipped in a barrel of the stuff. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of morgue and rotting beehive. That's when the lights flickered and failed completely, plunging the laundry into a darkness so absolute it felt physical, a suffocating black velvet. Our flashlights cut through the blackness, trembling beams revealing the piles of laundry like funerary monuments. And it was in my light that I saw her. Not a fleeting shadow, but a complete figure. Thin, cadaverous, skin the color of wet earth stretched taut over bones that looked ready to pierce through. She was crouched near the main machine, and in her bony hands, she clutched a bunch of those dried, fine herbs, as if preparing something. Her eyes, enormous in deep sockets, locked onto mine. They didn't just reflect the flashlight beam, they emitted a sickly, pale phosphorescence. A smile split her face, a grotesque gash revealing receded gums and small, sharp teeth, like a rodent's. What came out of my throat wasn't a scream, it was an animal roar of pure terror. My flashlight fell, rolling on the damp floor, its beam spinning wildly, illuminating fragments of the horror. I saw Rita frozen, hand over her mouth, eyes wide with a panic beyond tears. I saw Carl lunging forward, not to confront, but to pull Rita back, his face a mask of resigned horror. The figure didn't vanish. She stood up, with a strange agility that belied her fragile appearance. The smell increased tenfold, a wave of sweet, earthy putrefaction that made me gag. She took a step towards us, the dried herbs falling from her fingers like ashes. Other shapes began to materialize at the edges of the darkness, dimly visible in the fringe of the fallen flashlight's erratic beam. Similar silhouettes, pale, emaciated, with those same eyes glowing with hunger. We didn't think. We ran. We tore through the labyrinth of clean laundry like cornered animals, stumbling over carts, knocking over stacks of sheets that fell like dirty snow. The whispers transformed into a high-pitched, keening whistle that sliced through the heavy air, coming from all directions. I didn't look back. I felt the cold dampness of the basement, the smell of grave dirt and death honey pursuing me, a physical, violent, real presence. We crashed through the heavy steel door separating the laundry from the service corridors, locking it with trembling hands. On the other side, in the relative gloom of the concrete corridor, we heard a low sound. Scratch, like bony nails slowly scraping against the metal of the door. We didn't go back. Carl vanished from town, didn't even collect his things. Rita quit over the phone, her voice a thread of terror. I didn't go back either. I lost my job, my paycheck, my sanity. But the worst wasn't what we saw, or what we felt. The worst is what we brought with us. Because the stains didn't stay in the laundry. A tiny smear of dark earth appeared on the hem of my bedsheet, here in my tiny apartment in downtown Burlington. It smells of rotten forest. And last night, kept awake by the same dread that's consumed me since the basement, I swore I saw, in the dark gap between the closet and the wall, a pale reflection. 2 points of faint, phosphorescent light, watching. And the smell, that smell of wet cemetery earth and sour honey, hung in the air for an instant before fading. They know where I live. They found the way up. The underground laundry never released us. It just marked us. And the cycle of wash, dry, and fold has been replaced by something much older, much dirtier. Something that came from below and has no intention of going back into the dark. The first eye blinked. It wasn't a trick of fatigue, not a stray reflection of fluorescent light on the preserving fluid. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the upper eyelid sliding down over a faded blue iris and rising again, inside the glass jar labeled D447. My own eyes burned, dry from staring at the shelves in the Aspen Memorial Hospital eye bank, but the terror that froze my spine was genuine, raw, undeniable. In that cold basement where corneas waited for a second chance, something was watching back. My name is Gregory, and this had been my routine for 3 years. Tending to the eyes. Checking the jars, monitoring chamber temperatures, ensuring donor records were flawless before shipment for transplant. It was solitary, silent, respectful work. Or it used to be. It started subtly, with a constant feeling of being watched. I'd feel the weight of a stare on the back of my neck while filling out spreadsheets, a physical pressure making me jerk around, only to find just the orderly rows of jars, each containing its pair of eyeballs suspended in solution, inert, blind. But the feeling persisted, intense, palpable. Then came the insidious awareness that they were tracking my movements. Walking down the central aisle between the refrigerated shelves, I was absolutely, irrationally certain that the irises swiveled imperceptibly inside the jars, following my passage. A minimal movement, almost subliminal, but constant. I tested it. I'd walk slowly, stop suddenly, change direction. The impression that dozens, hundreds of dead eyes were adjusting their focus on me didn't fade. It grew. Cold sweat trickled down my back, even in the climate-controlled air. I told Anne, the afternoon shift technician, a practical woman with an easy smile that never reached her tired eyes. She laughed, said the basement isolation and the weight of responsibility were getting to me, suggested vacation. But I saw how quickly she avoided looking directly at the shelves before leaving. The dreams started that same week. They weren't ordinary nightmares. They were experiences. Vivid, agonizing, seen through eyes that weren't mine. The first was a tunnel of blinding lights and searing pain. It smelled of antiseptic and panic. I heard distant surgical voices, words sharp as a scalpel, hold the eyelid, more light. It was the perspective of someone lying on their back, unable to move their head, just their eyes rolling in desperation, catching fragments of masked faces, gleaming metal instruments. I woke up screaming, the taste of blood in my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. The dreams repeated, varying only in the final scene. Sometimes it was a dark road, headlights approaching too fast, the brutal impact. Other times, a dark room, an indistinct figure raising something heavy, the precise blow. It always ended with absolute, suffocating darkness and a profound silence that was the opposite of peace. It was death. I was experiencing the donor's final moments through their own eyes. Paranoia took root. I checked the records compulsively. The blue eye that had blinked, D447, belonged to a 52-year-old man, Joseph Almeida, hit by a car on State Route 17. Cause of death: severe head trauma. It seemed plausible. But then I noticed inconsistencies. Collection dates didn't match death dates. Medical signatures looked subtly different. One donor, Carla Sanders, listed as dead from a brain aneurysm at 34, but in my dreams, I clearly saw the gloved hand strangling her, the floral pattern of the bedroom wallpaper. I researched discreetly. There was no record of any Carla Sanders matching that description dying in the city on that date. The air in the eye bank grew heavier, colder. The constant hum of the refrigeration system turned into a high-pitched whine, and the eyes became actively hostile. Beyond tracking my movements, they started blinking, no longer an isolated incident. A jar here, another there. A brown eye in F221, a green iris in A112. The movement was always the same, slow, deliberate, obscene in its impossible normality. Sometimes, only one eye in the pair blinked. Other times, both, in perfect sync. I avoided looking directly, but felt the weight of their collective gaze, a physical presence pushing me down. I started seeing things in the reflection of the cold chamber glass doors. Pale, indistinct shapes behind me. When I turned, nothing. Just the jars, the irises seemingly inert, but with the feeling they had just looked away. My hands trembled handling the records. I found more cases. One donor, Marcus Foster, supposedly dead from a fall at a construction site. In my dreams, I saw the rotten attic floorboards giving way, saw the concrete floor rushing up, but also saw a face above, pushing. The record mentioned no suspicion of homicide. Another, a young woman named Lucia, death by overdose. In my dreams, I saw a syringe forced into her arm, saw the cruel smile of a man who wasn't a doctor. The eye bank wasn't just storing tissue for transplant, it was storing witnesses. Silent, powerless witnesses, yet furiously conscious inside those jars, trapped between the life stolen from them and the death that hadn't fully freed them. And they knew that I knew. And here now, writing this in a noisy Boulder diner, far from that cursed basement, but still feeling the deep chill of the chambers in my soul, I need to ask you a direct question. Have you ever felt that chill on the back of your neck, the absolute certainty that you're being watched by someone or something you can't see? Multiply that by hundreds. Hundreds of eyes without eyelids to close, without voices to scream, but with a residual consciousness, a memory of pain and betrayal that anchored them. That was the eye bank. Not a repository, but a waking purgatory. And I was the involuntary jailer, the only one who seemed to hear their deafening silence. It wasn't madness. Madness would be denying what I saw, what I lived. The dreams were too real, the inconsistencies in the records too glaring, the blinks were undeniable. A physiological movement impossible for lifeless tissue, without nerve connections. But it happened, before my eyes, which now struggled to close without seeing those other fixed pupils. Confronting Dr. Miller, my supervisor, was useless. He looked at me with a mix of pity and irritation, said the stress of isolated work was taking its toll, strongly suggested medical, psychiatric leave. He didn't mention the records. His eyes, however, small and piercing behind his glasses, avoided mine. There was something there, a wariness, a knowledge he didn't share. Or maybe it was just my own reflected terror. I couldn't tell anymore. The atmosphere in the basement became suffocating. The air seemed thick, viscous, laden with a sickly sweet smell of preserving fluid mixed with something else, something organic and decaying. The hum of the chambers had turned into a constant roar, background music for the horror. The final night was the worst. I was alone, as always on the night shift. An urgent delivery needed prepping. I had to enter the main cold chamber. The icy air burned my lungs. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows over the shelves. I went to section G. Jar G.309. Brown eyes, belonging to a Robert, death by drowning. In my dreams, I saw hands holding his ankles under the icy lake water. As I picked up the jar, all the others on the shelf, within several yards, turned. Slowly, inexorably, like macabre sunflowers, the irises swiveled inside the glass and fixed on me. Hundreds of dots of color and white, lifeless, yet charged with a perverse intelligence and ancient rage. I froze. The jar in my hand seemed to vibrate, cold as dry ice. Then, G.309 blinked. Not one eye. Both. Slowly, completely. An act of defiance, of recognition. That's when the whispers began. They weren't audible, not with the ears. They were invasive thoughts, mute screams projected directly into my mind. A cacophony of terror, pain, impotent rage, accusation. Fragments of the deaths I'd witnessed in the dreams, but now multiplied, overlapping, a symphony of agony. He pushed me. Why? It's cold. I can't see. Shut up, Gregory. He knows too much. This last voice, hoarse and full of hate, stood out. It didn't belong to any of my dreams. It was familiar, but I couldn't place it. Panic exploded inside me like a bomb. I dropped the jar. It hit the concrete floor with a dull thud but didn't break. It rolled, stopping at my feet. The brown eyes inside, now momentarily out of the preserving fluid before the jar came upright, stared at me, and blinked again. One last message. I ran. I didn't turn off the lights, didn't close the chamber door, didn't look back. I punched out, said I was sick. I never went back. Sent a generic resignation email. Dr. Miller called a few times, seemed genuinely concerned, or maybe just curious. I ignored him. I moved cities, came to Boulder, got any job far from hospitals, far from cold, far from silence. But they came with me. The dreams persist. Now they're not just past deaths. They're visions of the present. I see through eyes that are elsewhere. A man waking after a cornea transplant, looking up at an unfamiliar hospital ceiling, a confusion of memories flooding his mind that aren't his. A woman seeing for the first time in years, but seeing shapes in the corners, forms no one else sees. And sometimes in the dark before sleep, I swear I feel that characteristic chamber chill, that sweet, rotten smell. I feel the weight of a fixed stare. And when I turn to the emptiness of the room, a deep, cold certainty, cold as the preserving fluid, takes hold. Somewhere in some eye bank, a jar slowly shifted on a shelf, and its irises turned, seeking the point in space where I am. They know. They always knew. The eyes don't forget. They just wait.